we're going to move immediately to questions from the audience, and we're going to take questions until 4:15.
Well, thanks very much for this, let us say, 3 overviews on the historiography of fascism. First a comment, then a question. The comment. Just by chance, before I came last week, I decided to do a very, it's more intuition, a research on who was the most quoted author in the community of fascist studies in the end of the 20th century. And curiously, in 1988, it was not Renzo De Felice, it was not Paxton yet, it was a conservative historian, as a matter of fact, a good friend and colleague of George Mosse, called Stanley Payne. Because he was probably associated to the, let us say, to use Michel Daubry's, that was quoted by Kallis, essentialist definition of fascism. Payne's vanished from the historiographical overviews, but his book, Fascism Comparative Definition, was there, very much quoted by the community of historians working. So I think when we look at when we do an overview of the historiography of fascism, I think it's important to have, to look at this quantitative data. What was the authors, quoted between, let us say, De Felice and Griffith and other historians. The question I would like to ask is related with diffusion. Because I would like to because as, when you look at fascism in general and you do overviews, historiographical overviews of fascism, the main problem is we are talking about fascism as an ideology, we are talking about the era of fascism, we are talking about fascist regimes, and there is a contradiction that I think it's very difficult, to avoid when you look at the era of fascism and fascism in general, which is the contradiction between the revolutionary dimensions of fascist ideology and some fascist regimes, in this case, Italy and Germany, and the fact that the era of fascism, the most important diffusion elements of fascism in the 1930s were related to fascist institutions. The reason why Japan, Thailand, Vargas in Brazil look at Italian fascism was not because of fascist movements, but because of corporatism, but because of the single party, but because of nationalism, and because the relation between state and civil society, because in a way of political institutions. So the question is, basically, in your opinion, how do we solve this contradiction between, the floating dimensions of fascist ideology and fascism as a political regime?
It should be okay. Thank you very much for the question. Presumably you are referring to Wayland's point in that respect, that, what does get diffused, it's a horrible, sorry?
Not very much quoted by historians.
No, absolutely. This kind of, the word diffusion being a bit ugly in this process, but the idea that when we talk about the success of interwar fascism, we're not talking about the success so much of radical movements and their ideologies, as we can talk about what fascism is and so on, but this kind of authoritarian innovations, this idea. Of course, it's a contradiction in the sense that the way in which these two different perceptions of traveling fascism, let's put it like this, I know that's another horrible term, have very different effects and very different motivations in many ways. Absolutely, I agree with regard to this. But then again, they're not exactly divorced. So in many ways, the people who are, to use an example of an institution, the fascist youth model, which was probably the most successful such institution in the, in terms of appeal, in terms of transnational and international spread. What's happening in that case is that the people who are adopting this institution are making an active choice. The local agents are making an active choice to reject the revolutionary, into inverted commas, radical aspects of the movement, the mass character and so on and so forth, and engage with, not imitate, I try to make this point, but engage with inspiring political innovation. So I think ideology is there, and in some cases, yes, ideological revolutionary currents can be traced, if you like. But this is only a very small part of the transnational history of mobile fascism, let's put it in that respect. So there is a contradiction, but I don't think we can understand the diffusion of authoritarian institutions, authoritarian fascist, whatever institutions, without understanding and analyzing the active choices that local agents make vis-a-vis fascist ideology and fascist institution, whether these involve adoption, into inverted commas, or translation, or indeed rejection, making a choice not to have a mass political party, making a choice not to do this. So that's how I would say. So it is a contradiction, but it's not entirely a contradiction that needs to be resolved.
I wanted to say, yes, about Paint, you are right. It's an important author and historian. Even if you, as I said in my paper, I am writing a history of fascism, all fascism. And I saw the book of Paine, but Paine does not really write a real comparative history of fascism. He talked about Italy and Germany and Francoism, and it's not a complexive history of fascism, even it's very important. I think the tentative of real history of fascism are very few. You have Colotti, for example. Colotti tried really to compare and to compare, and it's important. I wanted to say another thing. Writing this book, I have forged my own definition because, as you said, it's really very difficult to compone with fascist movement, fascist regime, the small movement, etc. And I would like to read this definition, and if someone wants to, how do we say, if you want to destroy it, it will be very useful for me. So the definition, because I think it's difficult to speak in a book of 500 pages about fascism without an initial definition. Mine is that it's not revolutionary, you can imagine. Ultra-nationalist movement or political system opposed to Enlightenment, liberalism, and communism, which aims to transform society and the individual on the basis of a holistic conception of society through single party and or state dictatorship and violence. I think it's less complete in confront to Emilio Gentile definition, which is very, very precise. But for me, it was a useful tool, you know, to speak after of fascism. It's my way of answer to you.
Yeah, I'll comment only on the on your comment on Paine with respect to his role within this field. He appears in my longer paper. I decided not to go through all of the different permutations of generic fascist studies to date. But in terms, I mean, he's a prolific scholar in our field, of course, of Spanish fascism, and I believe of French fascism as well, and has contributed disproportionately in terms of the number of publications to generic fascist studies. But in terms of moving forward, in my eyes, his approach has been, I think, a bit more of a taxonomic one, which is composed of lists and bullet points and things that are largely static conceptions, which I think has been, if I can be so bold to admit, a bit of a failed project, and not, probably won't be included in any version of generic fascist studies moving forward, which I think, as Aristotle rightly pointed out, must be dynamic and inflexible, right, and not a sort of static list of unchanging atemporal factors.
Yes, I just wanted to make a brief comment and then maybe a question. What is great, I mean, one of the great things about doing in a conference like this is that we can see how the field is evolving, and for those of us, we have been in previous conferences, well, for many years. Like, to me, what Antonio said is striking, that Paine is not part of the presentation, because, when I started in the 1990s, he was. And then, I mean, perhaps, in my opinion, more importantly, in the sense that, in my opinion, I'm being very normative here, he shouldn't be an absence in these discussions, is the work of Ze'ev Sternhell. Because, Ze'ev Sternhell? Because, I don't know, it depends on a lot of things, subject positions and context where we approach fascism in the first place. But for people studying fascism in Latin America, that is my case. Ze'ev Sternhell was, and I think still is, a key author when analyzing fascism. In the US or in other contexts where perhaps people are lazy, they don't want to read in other languages, I mean, there is something about, some historians becoming more of a canonic figure rather than others. But I think we are serious about this. Sternhell needs to be part of the discussion. And here what is interesting, and I think, this emphasis on diffusion, transnational, obviously for me I'm biased in that regard, and trying to go beyond fixating on what fascism is, goes back to why many of us, and certainly that is my case, started doing this. And in my case, it was a problem with generic fascism in the sense of, these approaches that wanted to, rather than to fixate, to provide an essence, and then for the rest of us to be working bees, studying different cases, following the master definition of some self-described masters, and that's how it all began. And I think in the last 20 years, what many people did is going back to the fascists and starting to read them again and see what they are saying about what is fascism, whether there is something about fascism that goes beyond Europe, and so on and so forth. And here, and this is my comment, and I'm realizing, well, I have a small question. I will finish in 1 minute. My comment is that here is what Mosse's limits are at the same time that are typical of a previous context. They are also perhaps providing a challenge for the rest of us. Because it's clear that I mean, I will not be polite. It's clear that in Mosse's case, I mean, there is a strong Eurocentrism that is very frustrating for people that study fascism outside Europe. On the other hand, I have to confess that when I started working on fascism in the 1990s, and I was not alone, it was the work of Mosse that helped me a lot in trying to see and actually seeing things in Latin America that he was observing for Europe. I mean, and this is the paradox, I think, that his work is still important despite these more contextual limitations, which is this fixation on, this Eurocentric kind of take. And in that sense, and this is interestingly the case, that he was not very much translated into Spanish, And in Latin America, many people access Mosse through Italian translations because many people do not read English as well as Italian. And my question is about Gino Germani, because I always had the feeling, and perhaps experts on Mosse can illuminate a little bit, I mean, that Germani should, in my opinion, be part of the conversations. And there are strong links between this kind of triangle between De Felice, Mosse, and Germani. And Germani being Italian, Argentine, I mean, he's not as read as other key authors, in my opinion. But perhaps if you wanted to comment on Germani, I would appreciate it. That's my question.
No, so about Germany, I agree with you. I think it was important, and the link, there are a lot of names of historians, Paine, Germani. We could talk about Pierre Milza, too, which book about fascism was very important, and the link between De Felice and Germani must be noted. So, okay, I agree with this reflection. I think that the works of historians are forgotten very quickly. I think it's a lesson we can take about our discussion, and questo ci rende molto umili.
We can take one final question, but it has to be brief. Why don't we take a question over on this side?
Thank you. Hello, thank you for some brilliant papers. I have a question for Brian. When you were speaking, and I really like this idea of proposing visual, transnational, and digital kind of methodologies, and it made me think, what would happen if we kind of brought all of those three things together and thought about like meme culture and the far right and what's going on there kind of in online spaces, which is of course inherently transnational. And I wondered if you could speak a bit to that, the kinds of things you would expect to see as the shared online transnational visual culture today.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And actually, the expert in the room is Jennifer Evans, because she's written a book recently with Megan Lundrigan on tracking, Jen, remind me, online Holocaust denial. Is this the kind of general, yeah. And looking at Facebook, Twitter, and all kinds of social media data and using these kind of like large database approaches. I think, did you guys use Gephi for that, that project? Yeah. And I know of at least one other researcher who worked with Jen and I on the New Fascism syllabus to write a kind of a really brief article on the, I don't know if you guys remember this, but years ago in Wisconsin, there was this controversy over a high school prom photo where the boys in their tuxedos were seen delivering a fascist salute, and it was not entirely clear as to who had encouraged them to do that, but that entered the social media space, and then I can't remember Wademan Bjorn, I think, was the one who wrote this. He used Gephi to kind of track the movement of that image across social media space. And so I do think that that's kind of an emerging approach, and I certainly think that far-right memes, including, what is this, Pepe the Frog, right? Which that's largely kind of an alt-right thing that's begun to fizzle down. But I certainly think that this is an approach that could be used for that, and there are good examples to follow out there.
For those of you who are not able to join us for the screening of War Game last night, a film by Tony Gerber, the war game that they play out uses exactly that kind of tracking in order to simulate different kinds of emergency scenarios should there be another takeover of the January 6th type. So it is not only being used by economists, not only being used by historians, but also being used, of course, by the military now in order to simulate different scenarios and our responses to it. So I think there's a lot to learn and a lot to fear as well. So we're going to take a 15-minute break, and then we will come back at 4:30. So thank you very much.